Hi, and welcome to our video series on developing reflective composition students. This series is a two-part series, two videos, about 30 minutes each. In the first part, we're going to review the literature about reflection and metacognition and the benefits of using reflection as part of your pedagogy. And then part two focuses on the challenges to teaching metacognition and some recommended solutions that we have. My name's Linda Haas. I teach in the English department at the University of California, Irvine. I've been teaching here since the year 2000, and for about 10 years I was a writing program administrator in charge of the first two required composition courses here. And I've asked my colleague, Kathy Levine, to chat with me about these topics. Kathy, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
I've been at UCI since 2006, and I have taught in the composition program. Most of my work, though, since 2006 has been in the academic English ESL program, which prepares students for moving into composition. And I've been working with Linda the past couple years on some of our common students that move from academic English to composition.
One of the reasons I asked Kathy to have this discussion with me today is that we've been working together with another colleague, Robin Scarcella, for about 3 years now on a research study to learn more about students' perceptions of their own writing skills. And we've been comparing the students' perceptions to instructors' perceptions. And one of the things that we've learned is there is quite a huge gap between instructor and student perceptions about the same ideas. And so reflection and metacognition have come up over and over again as we've been researching and thinking about what are the next steps to the study we've been doing. So the first thing that I'd like to start with is just a quote from Ellis, Corrett, Ansel, and Levins. They're in cognitive psychology. And they say that empirical findings across several disciplines document that we can learn from both success and failure if we have systematic reflection about those experiences.
Linda, this brings up a question here as to what exactly is meant by systematic reflection.
Right, because I think not only do we not do very much reflecting, we talk about reflection being important, but we don't really give it the same emphasis that we give some other assignments. And I think part of that is we don't know how to teach reflection systematically, and it's not something that we have thought about very much. And so that's why I think this conversation is a really good place for us to just kind of stop and think about what does it mean to teach systematic reflection. So one of the things that I've been doing, I've always had students write blogs as part of the composition class, and initially I was having them write blogs because I wanted them to write for a different audience. I wanted them to write informally. I wanted blogs to be write to learn kinds of things. These are all, solid composition theories about why you should have students do writing that's informal. But more and more I've come to see the importance of blogs as systematic reflection. And when I first started thinking about using the blogs for reflection is when we were doing the results of our study. I just asked students to reflect on what we did that week and what they learned from it. And I found that they really didn't know how to really dig in and analyze what they had learned, or even with details summarize what they did. So I started giving them a 3-step process of how to attack the blogs. And that started with summarizing something that we did in class, and then reflecting on what they learned from doing it, describing with as much detail as they could, and then providing some evidence, either a quote from something they wrote or a description of something that happened in class. And I've been seeing my students slowly learn how to become better at reflection. But I think systematic also means that we need to make it routine. It's something that needs to be, it's a practice. One-time reflection is not going to do it. It's better to do it every week. And so I have them write a blog at the end of every week. Kathy, I know you've been doing a lot more reflecting in your classes as well. How are you putting reflection more into your class?
Well, I think that I've kind of like you, I realized that the students were not used to this idea of thinking about their own learning. They also were not used to the idea that writing can serve any purpose other than just, preparing something that the instructor wants as for the grade. And so the idea of using the blog writing as a way of reflecting on their own writing for some different purpose than just a grade was unusual for them. One of the things that I've been using reflection for is for them to think about feedback that I have given them on different assignments, and to think about which aspects of the feedback were expected and which things were surprising to them, and then to think about why this feedback was surprising. In other words, they were reflecting on kind of the gap between what I thought about their assignment, what they thought about the assignment, and then what they thought they might do to try to improve on or work on the following draft. So this was kind of new for them to think about their learning and my feedback and my ideas compared to their own ideas of their writing assignment.
The real benefit in that, I think there's something that Ed White writes about doing a lot. Every time they had a conference with him, they had to write him an email back and summarize what they got out of it, basically. So in the same way, he was asking them to reflect on his feedback to them, right? And I think that you're getting some double benefits from that. Not only are they reflecting and practicing reflection, but you're learning what they got and what they didn't get from your comments.
Yeah.
So, and I think that happens with a lot of reflection. It's something that I see in a lot of the blogs I have my students write. Not only do I see them working at becoming better and better at reflecting, but I learn a lot about what's in their heads. And that makes me, I think, a much better teacher in the classroom, because I know much more how to target where they are when I'm talking to them about certain things. So.
Well, I mean, this goes back to the research that we've been doing, where we've been finding that there's a gap between the perceptions of the instructor and the perceptions of the students, and some of the things that we don't even know that they are not paying attention to, and maybe there's a reason for it. That we're learning about the students getting inside of their heads.
That's right. I mean, and I think that's a great benefit of reflection for us is we learn a lot more about where they are. And I certainly, that's one reason I will continue to use it in my classes. So, all right, so we're going to move on and review some of the literature on reflection and metacognition. We're using those a little bit interchangeably, but really metacognition, generally when it's talked about in the research, is the more systematic, purposeful, critical, analytical reflection, and not just reflecting on what happened and summarizing, but really analyzing it critically. So we're going to focus on two specific articles. We've been reading a lot of different articles, and actually we're going to provide a Dropbox with several other articles and a bibliography for you. But the two articles that we're going to pull from mostly during this discussion are from Paris and Winograd, How Metacognition Can Promote Academic Learning and Instruction, and that's from a book back in 1990. And both Paris and Winograd are both cognitive psychologists and in the education field. And then another article that came out just last year at the Harvard Business School called Learning by Thinking, Overcoming the Bias for Action Through Reflection by Giada Di Stefano et al.
I think what's interesting about these two articles is that they are from two different time periods and from two different fields of study, which kind of shows the wide scope of importance that metacognition seems to be showing.
Exactly. Metacognition, the more that I've studied it, the more I've realized that it comes up in every discipline. Every discipline is thinking about metacognition. So let's start with some of the different ways that these articles define metacognition. It's not that they disagree, but they all have a slightly different area of focus in how they define it. So Paris and Winograd define it as when students reflect on their learning process and become more aware of their own thinking as they read, write, and solve problems. So it's very focused on school and students. Di Stefano defines it as the intentional attempt to synthesize, abstract, and articulate key lessons learned from experience. Reflection is a purposeful action requiring intentional efforts. And you see the word intentional twice there. So what I really like about their definition is that focus on, it's not just, oh, this is what happened, but I'm going to synthesize, abstract, and articulate what I learned from my experience.
And also the emphasis on the word purposeful, and this is where it goes back to the students when we're training them to use metacognition and be reflective in the beginning. This intention and purpose is what we need to focus on, because a lot of times students will just start narrating something instead of putting a purpose to it or making it an intentional reflection.
Exactly. And they naturally gravitate to summarizing and narrating because those are much easier modes for them to write in, and it's much more difficult for them to analyze and be critical. So I think that's very important. And for those who don't think that they could put a lot of reflective writing in their classes because the essays need to be the most important thing, I think this is a good argument for that, because true reflective writing is critical and interpretive. So.
Yeah, it's actually training them in the skills they need for doing the essays and critical reading and analysis.
And one last definition of metacognition, and this comes from the WPA. This is the Writing Program Administrators, a national organization who a couple years ago put out a framework for success in post-secondary education. They included these habits of mind, which I think are all very important, and I ask my students in their blogs to write about each of these habits at one point or another. The last one they have is metacognition, which they define as the ability to reflect on one's own thinking as well as on the individual and cultural processes used to structure knowledge. So, slightly different focus here, and I think it bespeaks the focus on rhetoric that they would have in writing studies, in that not only do they want students to reflect on their own thinking, but how their thinking is shaped by the culture and the time period in which they live, their rhetorical situation. Right, so now moving on from the definition, we're going to just show you a few little quotes from different fields and important scholars in the field of metacognition. These first two quotes come from researchers in cognitive psychology. So the first is from Flavel, and he's very well known. I see his name come up in almost every article I've read about reflection. There's been something from Flavel.
Well, he's been around a while.
He's been around a while, and he talks about how reflection or monitoring, he calls reflection monitoring one's own cognitive phenomena. It's an important role in not just learning, but he breaks learning down to attention, memory, comprehension, and problem solving.
Which are all the things that as instructors we want our students to be doing in the classroom.
Exactly. And then the second one by Ansel, Liebens, and Schohart I really like because, again, it shows that reflection is a very important type of writing, or if we ask them to do reflective writing, because it involves interpretation and critical examination, which is exactly what we're asking students to do with text when we're asking them to write about text in the composition classroom. They go on to say it involves absorption and evaluation of new concepts into personal knowledge structures and relating these concepts to other forms of knowledge and experience. So it's very much what we want them to be able to do when they leave our classroom.
And again, it's taking what they're doing with other texts and connecting it to themselves and their own experience. So it's giving more meaning.
That's right. I think that's an important thing that we've talked about before is when we ask students to write reflectively in a systematic way, we're asking them to make connections. And that's something that they're not particularly good at first. They need a lot of practice with that.
Yeah, exactly.
So Schoen next is someone else that I've seen quoted quite a bit. He's had quite a long career. He started out in philosophy, and then he went to teach at MIT in the business school and started working in organizational psychology, and he started writing quite a few books about practitioners and what makes a practitioner successful. And so he's writing about reflection in terms of practice, right? So practitioners constantly engage in the effort to reflect in action, which he calls thinking on their feet, and to critically examine a situation and craft the optimal strategy to deal with it if it occurs again. So we're going to see that come up, I think, again as transfer of knowledge. But so he says the capacity to reflect on action is necessary for practitioners to learn.
So in other words, this is something that is useful for students to learn.
Exactly.
Since they're going to be all practitioners in one way or another.
At some point. Yes. So last, from another important figure in education, Kolb, breaks learning down to 4 stages. The first one is having a concrete experience. The second is observing and reflecting on that experience. The third is forming abstract concepts or analysis and generalizations or conclusions. And then last, using the analysis and conclusions to test hypothesis in future situations, which results in new experiences. And then he goes on to say this is an integrated process. Every stage is mutually supportive of and feeding into the next, and no single stage is effective on its own. And what really
Wow. I have to laugh when I read this, because when I think of how many times many instructors, including myself, have had a tendency to kind of jump over stage 2, where we say, okay, they have the concrete experience, and we don't ask them to observe and reflect on that experience. We jump straight into, to the analysis and generalizations, and we don't understand why the students can't make that jump.
Exactly. In fact, I think I've been guilty of skipping both of the first 2 and going right into forming abstract concepts and generalizations. I mean, read this text and now write something where you analyze it and make conclusions based on your analysis. I mean, because I think I had the idea for a very long time. I don't have this idea anymore, that my students knew how to read, or they knew how to closely read well enough to where I could give them something and they would just be able to go and analyze it, and that's not true at all. So if we apply these 4 stages to a writing classroom, if the first having a concrete experience is reading the text, you really need to spend time reading that text with them. And going through that experience, and then let them observe and reflect on what they got out of that text before you ask them to start forming abstract concepts. Which I think, in this case, the observing and reflecting could be, the kind of informal right to learn, responding, response journals or things like that you could have them do after they've read something.
Well, I think part of the reason that I have been skipping that stage for so many years is because I hadn't really thought about it myself in my own learning. So when we think about it, when we read, what steps are we going through when we read? And if we're not really observing and reflecting on our own experience in reading, then we're not really thinking about how we know how to read.
Exactly. And I think sometimes I've also put the reflection at the end. And I think it's probably good to do it at the end as well, but it's interesting to me to see them in this order and think, okay, after they've read something, then give them some time to reflect on that before they have to start coming up with ideas about it. So.
Mm-hmm. And we can do this ourselves.
Exactly. All right, so now moving on to the last section, which is to go over some of the benefits of teaching metacognition. So this comes from Paris and Winograd. They say that when students have to reflect on their learning, it transfers responsibility for monitoring learning from the teachers to the students, which leads to independent learning. So I was tickled when I found this little cartoon online to illustrate this particular slide, because it reminds me of Freire's banking concept of education, which most of my students come to me with the banking concept, which says students think that they are the banks, and we are supposed to deposit our knowledge into those banks, and their only responsibility is to spit back exactly what we've deposited.
Mm-hmm.
And they also come to us with this consumer mentality, right? Consumer mentality of education. They're the consumers, and we must teach them.
Yeah, we provide the knowledge and they just have to remember it.
Exactly. So having them, and you can see how this makes sense, having them reflect on their learning and specifically write about what they've learned and then show evidence of it, the way that I've been asking them to do in blogs, can transfer responsibility to them, where they start to realize, oh, hey, I have to take part in this learning process. I'm not going to be a better writer unless I take responsibility for learning how to be a better writer, or for practicing the things that I need work on. So now I'm going to show you a couple of excerpts from students who have, these are students who wrote in week 1. So I'm going to show you some week 1 and some last week, week 10. We're on the quarter system, so we only have 10 weeks. Week 1 and week 10 of the same students. Some of the things they wrote when they first came in and some of the things they wrote as they were leaving. So in week 1, I asked my students to do a kind of a baseline self-assessment. Where do you think you are now with your reading and writing? What challenges do you have? What do you expect out of this class? How do you feel about this class? And so both of these slides are going to show you some excerpts where students are taking responsibility, or at least they're saying, I'm willing to do the work, which is the first step towards taking responsibility. So here, the student actually came out of AE. He went through your classes first, Kathy.
The academic English class.
And yep, and he says, most people say it's extremely easy, but not for me. But I've come to the conclusion it's going to be a lot of work, but I'm okay with that, and I'm willing to put in the effort. And then this next...
It might also be that this student is more ready, at the place ready to put in the effort because the student has gone through classes before the beginning comp classes through academic English, where they already realized that they've kind of started the process before of working.
Very true. This next student, it's interesting to me how often the students write the exact same things, even the same words. It's uncanny sometimes. So this student wrote, this class seems challenging, but I'm willing to put in the effort. It's like exactly the same thing. I'm willing to put in a lot of effort. It's almost like it's a meme or something. But she says something very similar. I expect to learn a lot, especially about grammar and punctuation. I'm looking forward to correcting myself and my many little silly mistakes. So the interesting thing about both of these slides to me, not only is that they're starting to take responsibility, but it shows me their perceptions about what writing class is going to be. Both of these students think that writing class is going to be about grammar and punctuation. And that's another real benefit to, we were talking earlier about how having students do reflective writing on a consistent basis lets you know a lot about what's in their heads.
Well, lets the instructors know that this is the way they view writing, and this is one of the things that comes out of my program a lot is the international students feel that writing means correct grammar, exactly. And we can kind of see this in these introductory blogs that this is where their head is, and we're going to be bringing them another angle as well.
That's right. You get refreshed on what the misperceptions are they're coming into class with that you want to get them to be thinking about in different ways. So the next benefit of teaching metacognition that comes out of both of the articles is they both say that routine metacognition can promote self-confidence, positive self-perceptions, and motivation, which are very important, I think, in a required composition class. 95% of my students, if they're being honest, will say, I don't want to be in this class. In fact, I had last week was first week for us, and I had a student in his first presentation of the class say, hey, I'm not really here because I want to, but because it's a requirement. So students aren't terribly motivated to take our classes, and they often come to us without very much positive self-perceptions about their writing.
The thing is about metacognition is if the emphasis is always on to reflect on what they've learned, then this can, help them because, hey, they have learned something, and then they can think about it and write about it, so that might help improve their self-perception.
Exactly. I think that's how it leads to confidence. They are stopping to realize that they learned something, and without that, they may never realize that they learned anything and continue with those negative perceptions. Winograd did some additional research with Johnson and found that negative self-assessment, when students had it at the beginning of the term, it often ended up being a self-fulfilling prophecy, and they did end up failing because they started with negative feelings. So here's a couple of blogs that reflect that. This quarter begins like any other quarter, filled with sadness and sorrow as I embark on another homework-filled journey. which I think is just hilarious for the literary nature of it. But then just
Uh-huh.
a real moment of honesty. I'm scared I won't survive this journey because I don't really understand. It's another thing I love about getting these blogs is, sometimes you will just see real clear moments of honesty about how they feel.
Mm-hmm. But the thing is, what is also interesting because they're blogs is they are actually writing to an audience here with a purpose, and the writing sometimes comes out better than when they're thinking of it only as an assignment for the grade. So here the honesty is coming out because she has like this purpose and this audience of getting these feelings out, and they
Yep.
come out better.
Exactly. I think I've said this to you before. I've seen some of the best writing I see out of my students comes out of their blogs, and then at the end of the term, I have them write a whole essay. It's a 5-page reflection essay where they go back and reflect over the whole quarter, and they're allowed to use snippets from their blogs, but they have to make them more formalized to put them in an essay. But some of the best writing I see comes out of those. Here's another student who says, I took a preparatory course in the summer, but I still don't know what to expect. First class came to an end, and I found myself in a stressful mood because I was unsure about this. And so this just again reminds me that students don't come into my class loving it and wanting to take it. They often are full of anxiety and stress about what's going to happen in the class. And then the last benefit that we're going to cover comes from Pearson Winograd, who say that routine metacognition can lead to self-management. And this is similar to responsibility, but they define it a little bit differently. They say that self-management is problem solving. So being able to reflect on something that went wrong and then change it the next time you go around. So it's being able to kind of fix the mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
And self-management is important because it's always connected to transfer. So, it's being able to learn something from our class and take it with them when they leave, which I think is very important. Something that we really want students to take away from their composition courses.
That we want them to be thinking about this as well, because we cannot assume that they are applying things and transferring knowledge on their own. That's why metacognition can help instill this, internalize this process.
Exactly. Well, they don't think about transfer of knowledge. They've never thought about that in their whole lives, which is, again, something that I think you have to talk with them about. And ask them. That's one of the things I asked them in the final essay is how can you transfer some of the things that you've learned from this class to your future? So it's, again, giving them practice thinking about those things. So here are a few blogs from the last week of the term. Some of the same students we saw in the earlier blogs that illustrate some of the self-management that they're starting to take on and to illustrate some of the things they've learned. This student says, I'm proud of myself. This class has given me the basic tools to communicate effectively to anyone, but also has helped me learn that being responsible about one's education is more important than anything else. So here's a student who learned that first benefit we were talking about, responsibility. Next one, I learned that metacognition is crucial because knowing where you stand allows you to see what you need to do in order to get to the level that you want to be at.
That is the student who's really learned it perfectly.
The student understands what metacognition is, the reason for it. And this student, the next student after this one, even more. This one I love because the student has had a change in her self-perception, her ethos. I think the work in this class helped me transition from a college student writing essays to pass a class, the consumer mentality, to a researcher writing to advocate what she believes in. So writing with a real purpose. I just love that.
Yeah, this goes back again to the idea that we were talking about earlier, that so many students come into our classes seeing writing only as something that they have to do for the grade, and they don't see writing as a really important skill with a purpose and an audience that they can apply to other courses in the rest of their lives.
Exactly. And last, the student writes, though it may come as a surprise, the greatest idea I learned from this class is the importance of metacognition. And then he defines it and says without reflection you can't improve, because we improve by learning from our mistakes, and reflection helps us identify our mistakes, and once we know what the mistakes are we can start to fix them. So this student has truly grasped the not only what metacognition is, but why it's important as part of his learning process.
And even says it well.
And puts a positive spin on the idea of mistakes, because so often our students are deathly afraid of making a mistake because they think it's going to lead to a bad grade or something. So
and this goes all the way back to all learning, and especially writing classes. We're always talking about the writing process, that all writers, even professional writers, they go through a process of drafting and changing, and it involves making mistakes.
Exactly. I've got to cut out some of those exactlys because I think I said it 100 times. All right, so
I was saying it too.
All right, to recap this first part of our discussion on the review of literature. First, research across the disciplines documents that metacognition is a vital, important part of the learning process. Next, that metacognition might be defined differently depending on the discipline and the focus, but everyone agrees that it entails purposeful, intentional, critical analysis of experience. And then some of the benefits of teaching metacognition in a routine way every week. And this can be done in many ways. It doesn't have to be done in blogs. It can be done in, in-class short writes. They can write on I know some teachers that have, at the end of a class session, they ask them to write one thing they learned on a card or one question they have on a card.
It can be at the end of an assignment, or when they receive feedback, or between drafts. It can be done in many different ways.
Exactly. There we go again. And so some of the benefits of that routine metacognition are that students take responsibility, that they'll have more self-confidence and positive feelings about the class. Oh, I see a typo there. I'll have to fix that afterwards. I can fix that later. Self-confidence and positive feelings about the class, and last, self-management that can lead to the transfer of knowledge.
Okay, basically we're training the students to internalize this type of thinking on their own, so it becomes automatic.
Exactly, part of their muscle memory going forward.
Mm-hmm.
So that concludes the end of part 1 of our discussion, and we're looking forward to talking with you again in part 2.